Welcome to the Naval Postgraduate School Center for Homeland Defense and Security lecture and webinar series. On behalf of CHDS and our co-hosts, the American Logistics Aid Network, Big City Emergency Managers, the Governor's Homeland Security Advisors Council, the International Association of Emergency Managers, the International City-County Management Association, the National Emergency Management Association, the CHDS Alumni Association, and the Naval Postgraduate School Alumni Association and Foundation. Thank you for joining us. Today, we will continue our America in Transition webinar series discussing what leaders need to know as we head into 2023. Our panel will consider recent trends in cyber attacks and explore how the cyber landscape will continue to evolve in the years to come. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's webinar. Eileen Decker is an alumna of CHDS and now serves as part of our cybersecurity subject matter expert team. Eileen is a member of the Los Angeles Police Commission, where she has previously served as commission president. She is also a law professor at USC and UCLA, and Eileen was the Los Angeles Deputy Mayor of Homeland Security and Public Safety, as well as the U.S. Attorney in Los Angeles during the Obama administration. During Eileen's tenure as Deputy Mayor in Los Angeles, she oversaw the launch of the city's major cybersecurity efforts, and as U.S. Attorney, Eileen's office headed up several high-profile cybersecurity policy questions and discussions in both investigation of the Sony picture hack, as well as the FBI's request to Apple to access the contents of the San Bernardino shooter's iPhone. Eileen brings a wealth of experience to today's conversation on cyber topics. Eileen, thank you for moderating today's session, and now I'll turn the program over to you.
Well, thank you, Dawn. And thank you to the Center for Homeland Defense and Security for hosting today's program. The topic for today, of course, is so timely. We can barely get through a day without hearing about a new cyber attack. And according to some statistics published by media outlets, cyber attacks for the first half of 2022 rose by 42%. And of course, we will await to see the full year statistics and what they hold, but the numbers from the first half of the year foreshadow a significant increase for the full year. And after all, we all have read about significant attacks this year, and the list of the different sectors and companies impacted is long and includes tech giants like Microsoft, Apple, Meta, Samsung, news organizations like News Corp, nonprofits like the Red Cross, even crypto.com, traditional financial institutions, car companies. In fact, one leading automotive company was hit by 3 separate ransomware attacks within the span of just 2 weeks. Airlines have been hit, school districts like LA Unified were hit, even a US prison suffered a ransomware attack that made CCTV and cameras and the automatic doors inoperable. Obviously, this is not just a domestic issue. Costa Rica declared that ransomware was a national emergency after multiple hits on government systems, including those that oversee exports, pension, taxes, Social Security, and even COVID-19 testing. And these are all just a few of the attacks that made news this past year. Almost every American is impacted in some way by the multiple data leaks that follow. And even if not, we're all left impacted by attacks like the Colonial Pipeline incident that undermine public confidence in our infrastructure. And from reviewing a list of today's expected attendees at this program, we have with us today organizations that have been subject to attacks in the last year, as well as private and public sector representatives involved in response and recovery. So we all know this topic is incredibly important. In fact, in one of the earlier programs in this series, the audience was asked what threats they considered most important. And it is no surprise at all that cyber attacks was the dominant concern by far of the attendees in that session. And so this is just a reminder as well that we do have survey questions for you to answer, and you can scan this QR code to engage in today's survey of 3 questions. And our panelists today will address these questions and so much more about this current Homeland Security challenge. And they'll describe the threats we're facing this year and beyond, and how our government, how the international community, and how all of us, individually and collectively, can better address this daunting landscape. But today's panelists are more than up to the challenge. So let me introduce them to you. First, Drennan Dudley. She is Assistant National Cyber Director for Budget and Assessment in the Office of the National Cyber Director. She works with White House and interagency counterparts, including the Office of Management and Budget, to plan for costs of cyber resources, assist in assessing the performance of programs, and further approaches that are models for success. Prior to her position in the Executive Office of the President, Drennan was professional staff to the U.S. Senate Appropriations Committee from 2005 to 2021. And there she had appropriations and oversight responsibilities for over $25 billion in annual Department of Homeland Security programs and over $196 billion in supplemental appropriations to respond to emergencies and disasters in the United States. She also brings to the White House a local perspective. Before Washington, D.C., she worked in Arizona at the Maricopa Association of Governments on Regional Coordination. Welcome, Drennan. It's nice to have you. Our next panelist is Paul Rosenzweig. Paul is the founder of Red Branch Consulting, a Homeland Security consulting company. He is also senior advisor to the Chertoff Group. He formerly served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy in the Department of Homeland Security. He is a professorial lecturer in law at George Washington University and a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He's also an advisor to and former member of the American Bar Association Standing Committee on Law and National Security and a contributing editor of the Lawfare blog. He is also an author of several books on cybersecurity and national security. Welcome, Paul. And the third distinguished member of our panel today is Chris Painter. Chris is a globally recognized leader and expert on cyber policy, cyber diplomacy, and combating cybercrime. He has been on the vanguard of U.S. and international cyber issues for over 25 years, first as a leading federal prosecutor of some of the most high-profile cybercrime cases in our country, then as a senior official at the Department of Justice, the FBI, the National Security Council, and finally at the State Department as the world's first top cyber diplomat. He has been involved in almost every major U.S. cyber policy for over a decade and has created innovative new organizations and approaches to deal with threats and take advantage of opportunities in cyberspace. Significantly, he was named the Bartels World Affairs Fellow for 2017-2018 by Cornell University, awarded the Order of the Rising Sun in 2018 by the Government of Japan for promoting Japan-US cyber collaboration, and awarded the Order of Terra Mariana in 2020 by the President of Estonia. Among other things, he currently serves as the president of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise Foundation. I know I speak for everyone in today's attendance in expressing our gratitude to each of you, and most especially for sharing your expertise today in this challenging area. And so with that, let's get to the program. Drennan, let me turn to you first. And I wonder if you could provide an overview for our attendees of the current cyber threat landscape that you're seeing from the White House perspective.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be on a panel with such distinguished guests and amongst a crowd of people who really do the hard work day in and day out. When I think about cyber and cybersecurity, there's such a nexus to emergency management, to homeland security, to both of those as professions, and also city and county management. The tenets that I think everybody in those professions really focuses on, obviously, protection of life and property, continuous operation of government and businesses that are critical, human health and safety, and of course, economic security. When you think about those tenets, and then also the constituents that go along with those tenets, individuals, critical infrastructure, government and business, and also disaster survivors who are often part of a constituency when they've gone through a difficult time. It just speaks to how important cyber and cybersecurity is. And so addressing those threats, to your question directly about sort of how we see the landscape right now, it's an ever-evolving landscape, and then also sometimes a static landscape. I feel like I should insert a quantum joke right here because it's sort of both things at the same time. Static in the fact that there are too many and consistently a lot of malware attacks, right? Whether they end up as a ransomware attack or as systems are affected by viruses, it's very frustrating to have that year after year be a consistent and pervasive problem when our school systems are hijacked, when healthcare systems are hijacked by bad actors who are seeking financial gain. That's sort of one of the static and sort of consistent over the last several years issues that we've had. Our critical infrastructure and supply chain, and by supply chain, sometimes that can be confusing, just literally the software and the hardware that we use day in and day out to make our networks go. That supply chain, along with all other infrastructure, whether it be water and sewer systems or the electrical grid, also remains vulnerable to sort of a persistent and sustained attempt at attacks to bring down those more systemic issues that are not quite directly related to the viruses and the malware that I talked about before. And then, I think it's interesting to think about, too, new technologies that are coming on board. They're ever evolving, which is an excellent opportunity for us to make gains in healthcare and to make gains in things that probably a lot of people in the audience use every day, which, is weather forecasting. So quantum computing can give us huge gains and innovations in both of those things, but it also creates some vulnerabilities as we bring new technologies on, including quantum computing, because it will change the encryption, will solve for the fact that some of this data has been encrypted, and some of that we want to keep safe and private still through that encryption because it's sensitive data, whether it's personal information or classified information. And so really there's, this idea that while we have some of the similar attacks that we've all learned to cope with or are developing ways to address them, there's also new technologies that are not only providing opportunity, but also can create some risk for us at the same time. On that same note, I'll just make a quick one about the actors that are involved in cybersecurity and actually lack of security in some cases. So, we have organized crime, we have nation state actors, but we also now are seeing a lot of activity done by even people who are contracted, quite frankly, in the field to trade in this sort of data that can cause harm. And so it's a frustrating thing to have, kind of an ever-shifting set of actors that are out there that wish to do us harm. And I would say that's really how I would lay out where we are in terms of the cyber threat right now. I'm sure some other panelists may have other ideas and insights to offer.
Absolutely. And Drennan, thank you for laying a great foundation for this. If I could, and you brought up the threat actor, so let's turn to the first response we received from our audience on the threat actors that concern them the most. And foreign actors, as you mentioned, Drennan, far and away from our attendees concern our experts the most. Chris, let me turn to you now. You have an interesting international perspective that you can bring to the table here. What are you seeing on the landscape? And obviously, it's the concern of our attendees, these foreign threat actors. What's happening in the international community?
So all the threats that we just heard about are true internationally, too, because, it's axiomatic, essentially, that, cyberspace is international. If I'm a smart cyber attacker, cyber criminal, or a nation state, even if I'm attacking from the room next door, I'm going to route my communications through several different countries to make it harder to find me, harder to bring me to justice if I'm a criminal, harder to do attribution if I'm a nation state. So there's always an international dimension. And what we've seen, especially given the audience concern, I think it's a fair concern. You have to be concerned about all those different actors. Criminal groups, especially with ransomware, are a big threat. That's something I think that has been around for a while, but it's gained a lot of notoriety in the past couple of years. I helped co-chair a ransomware task force to draw attention to this before the big Colonial Pipelines attack happened. But, even with criminal groups, there's a blurring between nation states and criminal groups, because often, as in the case of ransomware, the nation state, in that case, Russia, provided safe haven to some of those actors. They could do everything from direct their actions to allow them to happen because of corruption, or to simply not do anything about it to provide that safe haven. So we don't, and then there are some criminal actors like North Korea, where they're both doing criminal activity and state-sponsored activity, and some of the criminal activity is meant to help the state. So they're not clean lines between these groups. But certainly nation-state attacks, I think, have either grown significantly or we just have noticed them more in the past few years. We've always had espionage. We've always had, for years and years, for instance, China has engaged in a wholesale theft of intellectual property online. We reached an agreement with them back in 2015, which held for a short period of time on that issue. We've always seen intelligence espionage. Russia, China, two of the most capable actors, Iran and North Korea, not too far behind, but a different level than the two of them. But what we've seen that's changed, I think, recently is much more disruptive attacks by nation states. Russia, there was a big worm computer attack that they unleashed called NotPetya that took down the Maersk shipping giant and caused problems around the world. North Korea had something called WannaCry, which crippled the national health system. In the UK, the ransomware attacks have not just been about money, but about disruption of everything from healthcare to the fuel distribution of Colonial Pipelines. So it's not just been the stealing of information, which we're concerned about, but the ordinary person, many of the people in this audience, they don't care about that much. It doesn't impact them immediately as much. Even the theft of trade secrets has a longer term effect. You may not see the effect for several years, but disruption you see immediately, and disruption and things like what they call denial of service attacks, things like other kinds of disruptive attacks and worms. That is, I think, the unfortunate way of the future. And for criminal groups, it's linked with extortion too. So there's extortion, disruption. The good thing about that, the silver lining, if there is a silver lining, is, as you said, I've been doing this. Eileen, we worked together in Los Angeles as prosecutors many years ago, and no one cared about cyber back then. It was a little boutique kind of area. But now I think because of all these high-profile, high-impact attacks, even though the U.S. government has paid attention to this for years, it never really caught on as a clear national security economic priority until recently. And I think that now it has become a political issue. Now it has become something where not just in the U.S., but around the world, it's getting attention. And that requires a global response. That means that, yes, we have to do better law enforcement, and that's both international and domestic. Yes, we need to do better holding bad actors when their nation states accountable. We're terrible at that. It's not that we haven't tried. We're just not good at actually imposing consequences on the bad actors, so they'll think twice about doing it again. We need to work collectively with other countries. So, in short, there's lots happening on the international stage, and unfortunately, I think that's going to amp up. But the good thing is more countries are paying attention. There's more leadership, certainly in the U.S., but other countries too. And we're working together to try to defeat it, and doing things like my organization does, which is cyber capacity building to help countries and others be prepared for these attacks when they happen, because inevitably they will.
Chris, just to follow up on the foreign threat landscape, can you comment on the Russian Ukrainian war and the impact, if any, that has had on the threat environment?
So I think there's a bit of a false narrative around the Ukraine war, the Russian invasion, that cyber didn't play the role that we expected it would. Well, often people use these hyped up terms like a cyber 9/11 or a cyber Pearl Harbor. I've always hated those terms. That's not what we've seen, but that's not what we should have seen. What we've seen is them use it to prepare the battlefield. They attacked the satellite system before they invaded to try to get command and control down, and they did successfully. They went after critical infrastructure, but once they had boots on the ground, once there were troops there, you're not going to spend all your time and effort doing a cyber attack when you can just send a missile over there and do it. So, but they continue to use cyber, and the Ukrainians have been incredibly resilient. It's been really impressive to see how much they have been able to do over the years and how much they learned and how much not just the US, but other countries and industry have helped them. The thing that I think we haven't seen that people did expect was that sort of reprisals against the U.S. and other countries who sanctioned Russia, that they would go after our soft underbelly, go after our infrastructure. I don't think we're out of the woods on that. You've heard Jen Easterly at DHS and others talking, Chris Inglis talking about shields up. We need to be prepared. Yes. But the fact that it hasn't happened doesn't mean it won't happen. Putin may be concerned about escalation. He might be concerned about some other things. But that's still a tool in their toolkit. And I think we have to be aware that's a possibility. And it's an asymmetric threat where they can go after not just governments, but all the folks listening to this call. They can go after your organizations and cause some pain. And that still is very possible that could happen, which means we need to do everything else that we can to prepare ourselves for that. I still think that's a possibility. I think the wrong lesson to take from what's happening in Ukraine is cyber is not important. I think it shows it's even more important in the ways that we really should have expected it would be.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Paul, let me turn to you. And what are you seeing on the horizon for 2023? You come at it from such an interesting perspective with all the organizations you've worked with.
Well, first off, thanks for having me. I'm always delighted to return to the CHDS. I appreciate the opportunity. I think the first thing I would say is that I'm sort of struck by a divergence between the poll that you've run and what I hear in boardrooms and private sector companies around the country. If you ask them what they're worried about, it's ransomware, it's organized crime. That's 70 to 80%, by volume of the discussion that we have. And it's probably much more than that in terms of actual pain that people are feeling. I'm in Washington, D.C. right now, but I live half the year in Costa Rica that you mentioned in your opening. And the amount of disruption caused by ransomware down there at the granular personal level was quite extreme, to and including shutting down essentially the prescription delivery process of their nationalized healthcare system for at least a month. So though we tend, because we're in Washington, because we think internationally, to think about large-scale problems akin to the Russia-Ukraine problem that Chris was just talking about, which I certainly don't want to minimize, and I certainly don't want to be heard to say it's not not an issue to think about. It's very real. But at the coal mine, at the coal face of where people work and operate every day, the challenges of Russia and Ukraine pale in comparison to the DMV that can't get to its records, the healthcare system that's gone back to paper records and can't process people for healthcare interventions. Those are so what I to turn it forward looking. What I sort of project going forward is that that's going to be, for the next 3 years, the real locus of where the pain is. Our efforts will be more global, but in terms of actual immediate developments, it's going to be things like, how do we regulate cryptocurrency? What is the changing face of cyber insurance for paying for ransomware or stopping paying for ransomware, as some insurance companies are doing? Those are the kinds of so when I think of the threat landscape and how it actually impacts people, even though the international phase of this is in some sense sexier and a little more cool to talk about, and obviously we all like to talk about it that way, and governmental intervention, at the nitty gritty, it's going to remain things like fraud, data privacy. I mean, we just saw, to finish out, we just saw the largest data breach of a governmental system in recent memory in Australia earlier this week, that has literally taken that country by storm, because they sort of thought that they were immune or obscure, and all of a sudden they're not. And it's it's literally shaking the foundations of some of their ministries down there. The sense that Australians have of the lack of preparedness. So that's the kind of thing that on a day-to-day basis, I think is more likely to be a front of mind for maybe some of the people on this call, but certainly a lot of the people in the practical business world where a lot of the work I do is.
Yeah, I just comment on that. I don't disagree with Paul. I think cybercrime and cybercrime actors are still the main pain point. Nation states have become more active, certainly, but those are international as well. I mean, these ransomware groups are transnational organized crime groups. They're not necessarily domestic groups, although there are some, certainly. And sometimes they operate under, as I said, cover of government, but those ransomware groups have been incredibly disruptive. And it's not just stealing data, not just stealing information, which is serious enough. It's also disrupting business operations. And I think that's a trend that, look, there have been efforts like the White House's ransomware task force, international task force, things to deal with it. There is more attention. I would say one of the problems was just a couple of years ago, there was a big focus on nation state espionage and other attacks, and not enough focus on crime. And now that's changing, which is good, because as Paul said, I think that is often the most immediate threat to businesses and individuals in the U.S.
Well, you all have laid the foundation for a daunting landscape here. Let me turn to Drennan for a moment, because we're all going to look to our government for assistance and help. And the Biden administration has taken on, engaged in some recent activities, the executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity, national security memorandum to improve national security, and the pending national cyber strategy that we hear in the news is forthcoming. The executive order and the national security memorandum all aimed at preparation and response to cyber incidents. And so if we could turn to you, Drennan, to what are some of the tangible impacts that you have seen as a result of those efforts, and where do you see this going in the future from the Biden administration's perspective?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And Chris and Paul could not have done a better job of sort of laying out what you said, Eileen, how daunting all of this can feel. It's real. It's all of us that have to participate in combating it. And I am very proud to be associated with the Biden administration, who has put out, as you mentioned, an executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity. Many memorandums have come out. We've had a management memorandum on software. We've had one on quantum as well. Happy to pass along for everybody links to all of these excellent documents. At the end of the day, what each of those documents do is drive coherence. And that's really what our office is all about, right? The Office of National Cyber Director is driving coherence, also promoting collaboration between the public sector and the private sector, and aligning resources to our aspirations. So when you specifically mentioned the two documents that you did, what we're doing is clearly identifying a direction. That prevents us sort of lurching from headline to headline day after day, because it's tempting to do that with cyber. There's so much. And it promotes us all rowing our boats in the same direction and addressing the same gaps in the same manner to the extent that we can. That means that the bad guys, as our director likes to say, would have to beat all of us to beat one of us. And that's maybe the best way to fill in all of those gaps. So because of the documents that you mentioned, the Office of National Cyber Director, my office, and also the Office of Management and Budget teamed up and published a joint cybersecurity priorities memo. What that memo did was ask all federal agencies to very specifically include funding in their proposed budgets for fiscal year 24. That budget will be rolled out in February or March of this year. But it asked those agencies to very specifically name the funding that they're putting to the programs that they need to put them to, so that we can even better track the spending. You mentioned my long career on Capitol Hill, where I sat on the Appropriations Committee, and we know that if you can see the money and if you can measure the program, it's much easier to make progress and identify where you are making progress, and then where you're not, finding a way to do that. So by providing this clarity through not only the documents that sort of lay the strategic outline, or I shouldn't say strategic because we'll get to the strategy in a second, but that lay sort of the programmatic details for implementation of some of these, what feels like complicated and daunting cyber, but when you start to break it down, it becomes very methodical way to do it, and then applying resources to it, you start to get a lot of clarity on how much is being dedicated to specific things. One of the things we focused on, zero trust architecture, right? We could probably spend half the call just talking about what that is, but it's very specific ways of making sure that we are doing, preventing bad guys and bad things from happening at the lowest level possible. And that's really important. It's things like multi-factor authentication, logging how often activity is happening. We can measure that by laying out the details of how to do it and then making sure that we're applying the resources to it. Same goes for workforce development. It was one of the priorities that we had in the spending memo that we published. Infrastructure and supply chain protection, we talked about that a bit. So this clarity drives the alignment of our resources to all of our aspirations. It also then drives the collaboration between the public and private sector, because again, you can sort of see the roadmap. Not only do you see the programmatic details, but then you see the funding associated with it. And that does kind of drive us to, and Eileen, I appreciate you mentioning it. We have been in the process of developing a national cyber strategy in development right now. The top lines of that particular strategy are that we're rebalancing the weight of responsibility for cyber risk. For so long, it's been at the very lowest level. And it's the individual, it's the small business, it's the organizations that probably are, harder able or less able to protect themselves from this sort of daunting and uncertain where it's coming from threats and risk. And we're really driving that to the bigger organizations that have more capacity and more ability to prevent bad cyber things or address cyber issues from coming in the first place. And then the other big theme that I'd say that comes out of the cyber strategy is really investments in long-term re-architecture of the ecosystem. And again, that's driving at how do we row our boats in the same direction, in the same system where the workforce is available to us, the understanding of what issues we're addressing and when we're addressing them and how we're addressing them in such a way that it's comprehensive and allows the barrier to be secure around all of the systems, all of the people that need protection.
Thank you, Drennan, for that outline. You talked about a number of things, in particular relating to public-private partnerships, which at least public reporting says that the effort to conduct outreach to the private sector was tremendous in developing the strategy. If we could bring up the response to the second survey question, which was about how successful are we and effective are we at addressing cybersecurity and getting better, but still falling short. Paul, I'm going to turn to you because you talk so much about the practical implications of all of this. Public-private partnerships, we have these frameworks and strategies coming out of Washington, and yet boots on the ground. You're in the boardrooms, you're hearing what's happening. How successful do you feel that these frameworks, these strategies can be, and how can we be more effective at that public-private partnership that everyone's concerned about?
Geez, if I had a really perfect answer for that, I'd be making a lot of money as a consultant, and I'm not. But look, I think that unlike the last one where I thought that the respondents had the wrong answer, this time I think they have the right answer. The majority of them. It's getting better. It's certainly much better than it was in 2015 before we passed the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act. So this is good. Where we are, I think, still falling short is in using the levers of government to incentivize private sector actors to do a better job. We are on the horns of a real dilemma, which is that it's absolutely clear that cybersecurity is a public externality. Nobody's incentivized to provide the right security beyond what is necessary for their own business, even though their own failures have massive impacts on other people. I mean, think Colonial Pipeline as just the most recent significant example. So what the government needs to really focus on, and they're doing a much better job. I mean, this is not a critique of the Biden administration, it's just that this is a process, is carrots and sticks, right? Providing people, we still haven't found the right set of carrots, right set of incentives that would actually, give benefits to private sector actors who are good at cybersecurity in a way that is meaningful to their bottom line and as well as to their public persona. And then on the other side, we've never come to grips with the lack of any punishment. I mean, I don't want to use that too strongly, but the lack of any adverse impact on a company that fails. Right? Their stock prices go down and then go back up within 3 months, as if nothing had happened. They owe nothing to the people who are harmed by their activities. So, broadly speaking, I think what the next set of steps is to get beyond the idea of government just as information source, which is sort of where we still are right now, to hopefully a non-regulatory, standard-setting, incentivizing structure that actually continues to move the ball forward. We have done a good job. The NIST cybersecurity framework is obviously the best example of that. But at the same time, you go into a boardroom, as I do, and you bring out the framework, and the CISO says, I need money to do this, to get up to the framework standard. And the CEO says, what's in it for me? And we haven't answered that question very readily yet.
So I was just going to take a slightly more darker view than Paul. I mean, look, we've been talking about incentives for as long as I can remember. We've talked about in the 2003 National Cyber Strategy, and we still haven't made progress. We made some progress. Yes, things are better. There are two things I'd say. One is, public-private partnerships become a mantra. We say it, but it has to have meaning, and it has to be practical, what's being shared on both sides. We've been debating getting companies to report incidents for as long as I can remember, too. Eileen, I remember when Janet Reno was the Attorney General, we did an event up in Silicon Valley, and that was many, many years ago. Finally, after some of the recent events like Colonial Pipelines, Congress passed for critical infrastructure, which is critical, so you can't live without it. That's the whole idea of critical infrastructure, requirements that they report, but even that's going to take a while to phase in. So I salute obviously the strategy is yet to come out, but my understanding is the strategy from what you said and others is going to lean more into, there's responsibilities too. It's not all about incentives. There's potential regulatory and other things that will come down the pike, which I think are long overdue. And you got to do it smart. You can't just be regulatory for the sake of regulation, but we put this off too long. Look, I'm a recovering lawyer. There's no standard of care for cybersecurity. The reason that people have all these externalities is there's no consequences, there's no liability. There's no real liability regime. We've got to figure out a way to do it. And I think somebody has to be regulatory. And I'll tell you this too, that if the US doesn't do anything in this and just sat on their hands, other international organizations like the EU have and will, and that affects US companies because they're global companies. All of you guys are global, whether you think you are or not. And so effects like the General Data Protection Directive in the EU, now some of the new cybersecurity laws will have an effect on even US businesses. So we need to act and mix it. Yes, incentives are important too, but we also have to have a hammer, especially with critical infrastructure.
So if I can just follow up on that, I agree with Chris. We haven't gotten a handle on the incentives side, but I would also say, frankly, we haven't really tried that hard. Giving people a gold star and saying you got good cybersecurity is not a real incentive. I think from my own perspective of things like what we did at Customs and Border Protection at DHS for shippers with CTPAT. An old colleague of mine, Adam Isles, has suggested that you can do stuff like that where companies get affirmative relief from regulatory burdens that is of cash value to them. And if you bring that along as kind of the incentive program, and they have to meet standards, they have to show that they're doing an effective defense program and meeting MITRE attack standards or whatever it is you do. I actually agree with you that we have not leaned nearly hard enough into the liability regulatory disincentive sticks side of this. But I also think we haven't leaned very hard into side, and that in part is because we haven't really known what it is we're trying to achieve, and we as a country have this, governmental hands off. That government is best which governs least on both incentives and punishments, kind of idea that goes back to our founding.
Yeah. Hey, Chris, you mentioned the EU taking action, and I think from a lot of folks' perspective, it's daunting in part because there's no control and partnerships on the international level where a lot of threats emanate from. Could you dive into that a little more on what is happening on the international level? Are there greater partnerships happening? Can we expect greater reform and efforts on that level?
Yeah, I mean, first, the EU is just more regulatory than the US in many ways. It's not the same culture that Paul described. And in fact, they lean probably too far into regulation, so they go the other extreme. But that's a fact. They've not just done this data protection directive where the US still doesn't have really a data privacy law yet. And I know they're moving slowly, inching toward it, but that's an issue. They have cybersecurity laws in place. Now they have things like voluntary certifications where you can almost like getting a UL listing, saying that, there's a lot of things that they're doing, a lot of good things too, that I think we need to look at. The other issue is the partnership issue. And, we need to partner closely with our like-minded allies and friends. And that like-minded group is bigger than just the traditional allies. It's a big tent like-minded because we're all facing these same threats. So being able to take action against bad nation states or even against criminals requires lots of partnerships. Now, we've done that for years, and cybercrime particularly, as you know. We've been for many years trying to forge international partnerships on law enforcement. We have something called the 24/7 network, which has like 80 countries that now are part of it to exchange evidence. But in terms of working with other countries on the full suite of cyber threats, we're doing a lot more of that. And one byproduct of the Ukraine war is that there's a lot more commonality of action and thought among Europe and the US and Japan and parts of Asia. Things like sanctions, what the European Union calls the diplomatic toolkit that they have. There's much more commonality of purpose, which is great, because if it's just the US acting, we're only going to make modest progress. We need a more global approach with all our allies and partners and drawing it together. And I do think that is trending in the right direction, which is good. There's a lot more to do, though, but it's going in the right direction.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Let's pull up our third question, survey question that the audience was asked to answer. And how prepared is their organization? And more prepared than last year, which is good. Moderately prepared, not prepared at all, only 8%, which is, I think, good news. And we have a whole variety of organizations represented today in the audience. We've talked a lot about the federal level, international level, but I wonder if we can talk about preparation and mitigation from a state and local level, where the rubber really hits the road, right? We've read about major cities across the country being hit and recovery efforts costing millions and millions of dollars. And Drennan, I wonder if I can turn to you, because you do bring, in addition to being at the White House and having worked on the Hill, your foundations were in local government as well. And I wonder if you can talk about the perspective on the state and local level, creative ways to address this issue in preparation, and what is Washington doing to help the state and locals in this very difficult era where they're very short on resources.
Absolutely. I mean, resources is a key factor that we hear over and over and over again. I think each one of you have mentioned that we can identify the problem all day long, but it does take money to overcome some of the problems that we're at. This was the only way to get some gains right away, and I can talk about that in a second. But we're very, very pleased to be able to put $1 billion to a state and local program for cybersecurity specifically. I think probably many people on this call will be hopefully benefiting from that program. We actually have seen some successes, and I can talk about those in a second too, from some of the grant funding that was spent at the federal level by state and local governments before we even had the cybersecurity program, for those organizations who are recognizing are already suffering from problems from that. I mean, I think committing resources to it, helping people understand how to commit state and local resources, but also making some federal resources available. I'm super proud that we have $1 billion over the next 4 years to be able to implement and put to this critical problem, because like you said, Eileen, I mean, this is where the rubber meets the road, is at the state, local, tribal, territorial level. I think on the creative front, which was your question, I would say a couple of different things. One, this is the time, I think, where we've seen the most successes, and this is definitely the time where, putting aside turf wars, and I know we all say that all the time about everything, but having everyone at the table to talk about this problem is key. It is a healthcare problem, it is a law enforcement problem, it is a critical infrastructure, but it's a public works problem. It's everybody sitting at the table and understanding this. You know, one of the big campaigns we did from the Office of the National Cyber Director during Cyber Preparedness Month was see yourself in cyber. And I would say that the communities that we've seen been most successful is just that. They have seen themselves in cyber. It's no longer an over there problem. I think Chris talked about, you know, this being like a niche business, you know, in the beginning. It's no more an over there problem of nation state actors that the federal government will help you with or tell you what to do. And that those days are gone. I think we've all recognized that. And so figuring out how your community is affected by the problems that we've all tried to help lay out here today, and happy to keep rolling up our sleeves and doing that in the future, is going to be critical. So because cyber does kind of blast through any of those traditional boundaries, be them, you know, geographical, conversational, anything else, I think making sure everybody at the table who's willing to come and talk about this. There's also some very simple and inexpensive ways, I think, to get started. One of those is just to designate someone in your organization to be the cyber person, whether that's a young, up-and-coming sort of, you know, enthusiastic person you know, who has just joined your staff, or somebody who's been around for a while and wants to learn something new. Designating one person to take on cyber and really understanding what that means for your organization can be a key creative and simple step that can be taken, putting them in charge of cyber issues so that they can bring it to the C-suite level if needed, I think is really critical. I mentioned some of the investments from grant funding that we've had already have really demonstrated that when people sit at the table together, larger solutions come to bear. So whether it is using the Fusion Center to make sure that all of the information that is needed is shared and available, so that the threat is clear and how to attack that threat is clear. We talked a little bit about standards already. I think thinking clearly through, do NIST standards need to be further, you know, promulgated in some way so that state and local governments can make even better use of gains that the federal government has already had, because we've had a collective effort on that. So standards, I think, is one. Fusing the data and the information and the intelligence is one. And then we've seen through some of the grant programs I mentioned already, bulk buying or collective buying of simple things like firewalls, multi-factor authentication, implementation, so that if you're the tiniest of governments and you're working with everyone else around you, it becomes less daunting of a task to implement some of these just basic hygiene activities. Everything from, you know, like I mentioned, firewalls, to training, to software licenses, and I know that it's easy for me to sit here and say that, and it's harder to do at the local level because of all sorts of reasons. But I think this is, again, collectively bringing people to the table can be a useful way to do that. There are also federal resources that are available to that. We have the Cybersecurity Advisor, which is a program through CISA, Cybersecurity and Information Security Agency, Infrastructure Security Agency. They have a program where if you need advice and someone to come in and help you and steer and guide your organization, they'll have an advisor that will come and sit with you and talk about those kinds of things. I think making use of those resources can be really helpful. You know, we can go on and on. There are many states that I could list, but they're probably on this call too, so I won't call them out and embarrass them. But that also make use of workforce programs. So whether that's something like if you have a cybersecurity program at universities in your community, maybe those students, as they become more senior and more capable, can make themselves available to communities to guide them through, a better way for their community to develop a cybersecurity program. And so there are many examples, many of them are already happening at the state and local level. Perhaps it's on us at the federal government to start to collect some of those and share them in a way that they're even that much more accessible.
So can I just add, there's also a resource out there. I'm on the board of something called the Center for Internet Security, which does, among other things, runs the multi-state ISAC, Information Sharing Analysis Center, and also the election official ISAC, and has a set of controls, the CIS controls that are used around really the country as the basic cyber hygiene metric that people can use. So if you're a state or local government, look into the multi-state ISAC, look into being part of that. I think many of you are already members because I think every state is a member now, which is great. And that provides a lot of service, a lot of products, a lot of capability that scales better for you. And that organization works with DHS in that context.
Absolutely. And I'll just add my pitch from the time I was with the city of Los Angeles. We took advantage of a lot of the federal resources, both at DHS, the multi-state ISAC, and other resources. And it was a phenomenal contribution to the infrastructure in the city of Los Angeles and made everybody better for it. So I add my experience to that as well. So thank you both. I know Dawn has a number of questions that have been coming in from the audience. And if you do have a question, just a reminder to put it in the Q&A, and Dawn will be looking at all of the questions. So Dawn, why don't I throw it to you at this point for questions from the audience?
Thanks, Eileen. Several questions, and I'm going to really throw those open to the panel. And Eileen, feel free to moderate if one panelist you'd like to have field that. First, we have several questions. Paul, you earlier mentioned cryptocurrency and how that is exponentially changing the cyber landscape. Really, for anyone on the panel, what is the role of crypto? And as that has been evolving in recent years, what's been the impact on the cyber threat?
Paul, since you brought it up, you want to handle that one?
Yeah, well, I have perhaps an idiosyncratic view, but I think that the growth of cryptocurrency has been the critical factor that has energized much of the ransomware debate. There aren't a lot of kidnappings for ransom in the physical world anymore. And the FBI, in fact, their latest statistics, they clear something like 93% of kidnappings. And the reason is because at some point, there was a physical exchange of the person for the money. And that was a vulnerable point for the malicious actor. Cryptocurrency has changed that completely. It has anonymized the ability to pay ransom. It has allowed malicious actors to remain stuck in the weeds. I've seen studies that range on the extent to which cryptocurrency is used in criminal affairs, from 85% of all transactions to a low of about 40% of all transactions. Either way, cryptocurrency, though it has really legitimate use case scenarios for people who have a legitimate interest in not disclosing their finances, like protesters in Russia, for example, or in China, it has also been a major enabler of malicious conduct. And at a minimum, it's crying out for regulatory intervention at the U.S. and international banking levels, something along the lines of the FATF, the task force on foreign transactions and money laundering.
So I just add to what Paul said, that the ransomware task force that the IST think tank out in California put together, that came out just before Colonial Pipelines. One of the key recommendations was around, or some of the key recommendations were around cryptocurrency. And it wasn't that cryptocurrency should be banned. It's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to go away. It does have legitimate purposes, but know your customer rules. Any money laundering rules, at a minimum, we should be applying those rules to cryptocurrency. We got to be working internationally, as Paul said, to get a handle on it. Treasury and others have been active in that area, and so I think there's more to be done. But I agree with Paul.
Excellent.
Eileen, we have several questions here about the role of the emerging cyber insurance field, and what are the panel's thoughts on how that might affect resilience and strengthen our fortification efforts.
So maybe I'll start with that one because I just spoke at a big insurer in London about this issue. Look, I think a lot of us had hoped that cyber insurance would be a major driver for better cyber hygiene because the underwriting would force companies to be and other covered entities to be better. That hasn't happened. However, because of ransomware and the very high payouts, the cyber insurers have said, look, this is no longer just a loss leader for us. We're not just out there trying to get market share. We can't afford these payments. So we're going to start both cutting back the amount we're paying, and we're going to start enforcing underwriting standards about cyber hygiene and other things. And so I think it has the potential to drive better cybersecurity. We haven't seen it as much as I think we hoped so far, but I think it certainly has the potential to do that in the future.
Eileen, we also have several questions from the audience about philanthropic or white hat cyber hacktivists. Any trends that the panel are seeing either domestically or certainly Ukraine's encouragement of hacktivists to step in? Chris, anything that you're seeing on that landscape?
Yeah, look, I worry about that. I mean, I certainly understand Ukraine doing that. And I think especially in the conflict with Russia, they need all the resources they can get. The thing is, unlike a country who lives by things like the international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, things you can do and cannot do in war. People who are third parties who are not nation states can do whatever they want. So that you don't want your cyber army going after critical infrastructure and turning out the lights in a country going after civilian infrastructure. You don't want things like that who could be even worse and more escalatory. So you got to be careful when you talk about enlisting, third parties, because they're not monolithic. There's even anonymous is not just one entity; it's a whole bunch of people, right? So, there's some uses for it, but I think we've got to be really cautious when you enlist those folks. Now, another model is what Estonia has done, where they have a volunteer sort of cyber army, but that is more under the control of the Estonian government when they're put into place when they're used for defense and other purposes.
Dren, several of the state and local participants have asked, from your perspective, have you seen good success stories, local and state governments who have taken steps to harden their cyber defenses, or any models that you're pointing to in either programs or jurisdictional examples?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many out there. Like I mentioned before, so many communities have already made use of some of the grant programs or some grant funding, even if it wasn't specifically the cybersecurity grant program. So, California is fueling their efforts through making sure that the Orange County Regional Fusion Center is their place where they kind of put together all the information and make sure that it's available so that the community at large can figure out better ways of tackling cyber and cybersecurity issues. The Bellevue water system in Washington State took really important steps to protect themselves against cyber attacks by doing risk assessments. That's something I didn't mention before, and which I had. Just doing an assessment from the get-go. I think it does cost money, but it also can arm you with information that you need. Massachusetts is doing awareness training along with prevention and detection of intrusions that sort of aid cybersecurity planning in a way that they're fusing the public and private sector together because they're doing it jointly together. So this is again where that idea of bringing everybody to the table together. There's so many other examples that I could think of that I can list, but I think a lot of it is making sure that there is a way forward and clearly articulating it whichever way it is for you. I mean, we get a little worried at the federal level that if we start dictating the way it should be done and it doesn't fit the state and local community, it's not appropriate, right? I mean, there are so many innovative things that happen at the state and local level, tribal and territorial level, that we don't want to step on as the federal government. But learning from each other and figuring out what those best practices are because that community is similar to yours or particularly crack the nut on something. I think might be an area where the federal government can continue to put those best practices together and really solidify them. There are a lot of lessons from the international community, as Chris can speak to, and also from the federal government that we have learned by sort of corralling all the departments and agencies together and implementing something like zero trust architecture that I think also can be lessons learned for state and local governments. But a lot of that is already happening. It's just the scale at which it can happen, and also having the resources. And we understand that is a big part of the issue.
Eileen, mindful of time, I'll one question for anyone on the panel to field. For state and local government participants in particular, what element of infrastructure are you most concerned about locally or nationally being potentially the target of cyber attacks for anyone on the panel?
What do you think, Paul? Let me throw it to you.
That's a hard one. I mean, I think we've done a pretty good job at protecting the ones that I'm most worried about, like the electric grid and the financial sector. They're much better off. So I would probably have to say one of the next ones down that's important, but doesn't know that it's important yet, like the healthcare system.
Right.
Yeah, I'd only say that, yeah, we've done a better job with electrical power grid and financial institutions, but not nearly enough to make them resilient to an attack. So, look, Colonial Pipelines was sort of a self-imposed fuel distribution. I mean, they cut off their own system because of the ransomware, but I still think there are vulnerabilities out there. And electrical and power undergirds all the other infrastructure. So I still worry a lot about that. But I agree with Paul that the ones lower down are not taking the precautions they need to, and they're probably more vulnerable.
Right. It seems like this is an all hands on deck. Everyone needs to be on high alert when it comes to this type of a threat. Because we are, Don, I believe we're out of time, if that's correct, or closing in on it. Can I turn to the panel for final comments? Paul, why don't I start with you, if you don't mind? Closing comments or recommendations to members of our audience today.
Well, I guess the most important thing I would say going forward is that I perceive us as on the cusp of a changing time now. You've heard us talking about ideas like more incentives, greater liability, the need for greater coordination internationally, locally. I would characterize us as at the end of the beginning. The last 10 to 15 years have been the start of our understanding. And we've made great progress from, 2006 with the very first realization that there was an ICS crisis to now. But we're now at a point where the building blocks are in place, and we're going to start actually playing with the levers of control at varying levels, internationally, nationally, state and local, litigation in courts, whatever. And so I would say that my biggest advice would be keep abreast of what's happening, because where we are today is not going to be where we are 2 years from now. I don't know exactly where we're going. If I did, I'd be making a lot more money as a consultant than I am. But I do know that we are changing.
Thank you, Paul. Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Paul. I think the past efforts are not sustainable anymore. We're too dependent on these technologies for everything, and not just us, but around the world. So there really does have to be a change. And I think there is, as I said in the beginning, I think for the first time, I've really seen cyber become much more of a national level, political, and even the grassroots and ordinary person priority. And unlike the past, where it becomes a priority for 10 minutes and people forget about it, I think it's now here to stay. So that means we're going to have to take action. We can't just let these vulnerabilities simmer. We can't just be held hostage to either criminals or nation states attacking some of our infrastructure or stealing our information. We have to do something about it. And that's going to be a slow process still. But I agree. I think we're at a turning point where we're going to see a lot more in the next 10 years than we have in the last 25.
Thank you, Chris.
And I agree. Pay attention. This is something. Glad you all tuned in, but stay involved. Make sure you're paying attention to this issue.
Absolutely. Drennan, closing comments from you?
Yes, I mean, I couldn't foot stomp more what Paul and Chris both said. We need to keep paying attention, and that means also making use of the federal government programs that are already out there. The Cybersecurity Advisor through the CISA program, which I'm so glad both Eileen and Chris mentioned the MS-ISAC. I failed to mention that one's huge, opportunity and organization to make sure that the needs of state and local governments, tribal and territorial governments are taken care of. The billion-dollar grant program that we have that has made funding available for that, and then know that not only taking advantage of the federal programs that are there now for people in the audience who need it, but also to know that our ears are wide open and we need to continue hearing what it is. So stay engaged, as Chris said, but also keep us engaged. Let us know what it is that you're seeing at the state and local level, tribal territorial level, that we can assist with. And I know sometimes, it's not just that we're here to help. We really want to make ourselves available for understanding what's happening at the state, local, tribal, territorial level, getting that feedback in a way that we can be productive and helpful partners in making sure that this threat is combated, because it does take all of us to really effectively address it. So we are all ears here and make use of the tools that are already out there.
Well, Drennan, Chris, Paul, thank you very much for an excellent conversation today. I appreciate all of your knowledge and experience coming to bear today and addressing all of these issues. We could speak for a couple of hours more if we had time. We look forward to continuing these conversations in the future. But to wrap up the closing comments, this is everyone's responsibility to remain aware and to do everything possible to address this threat. Dawn, thank you. And I turn it over to you for the closing.
Eileen, thank you again, and to the entirety of our panel for today's conversation. On behalf of CHDS and all of our co-host organizations, also a thanks to our audience for joining us for today's discussion. Several resources were mentioned in today's conversation, and we will post links to those on the webinar website following today's broadcast. And finally, we invite you to join us again on Wednesday, January 11th, for the capstone of our America in Transition webinar series. In that program, we'll look back at the 4-part discussion that we've had throughout December, and we'll visit with a panel of national experts to reflect on the conversations we've had thus far and discuss what that means for leaders across the nation as we head into the new year. Again, thank you to our audience for joining us, and have a good day.